Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, we're going to be talking to a driver's ed teacher. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about road safety in the state of North Dakota. In fact, Governor Doug Burgum just started what he calls his Vision Zero initiative. And a lot of what we talk about is drunk driving. A lot of what we talk about is distracted driving, right? Cell phones are the pet peeve of everybody now. And, so we're constantly doing more and more enforcement on that. What we don't talk a lot about is driver's education. Now, I didn't know this, but there's just 6 public schools left in the state that have driver's ed programs. We have declining appropriations for this. School districts across the state are cutting this. I also didn't know this, although I took driver's ed in high school. I actually had my driver's license before I took driver's ed in high school, but I took driver's ed as part of my high school curriculum. But it's not actually required by the state to graduate. I think some school districts require it, but not all of them. So as we struggle to make our roads safer, as we talk about, accidents and collisions and fatalities, if we talk about distracted driving and all these other things, why are we not talking about driver instruction, right? Particularly for teenagers who, I don't think I need to tell you, are some of the most dangerous drivers on the road. If we could invest a little bit more money teaching these kids how to drive better, well, wouldn't that be better for all of us? Anyway, it's an interesting discussion, and you'll hear about that a little bit later in the show. But before we get there, let's talk about the income tax. Now, earlier this legislative session, earlier this year, I did an interview with State Representative Craig Headland. He is a Republican from the Jamestown area. He is also the chairman of the House Finance and Tax Committee, and he proposed a constitutional amendment that would take money from some of the legacy fund's earnings. It would be half of the legacy fund earnings in a 2-year cycle. Now, we're not talking about the principal of the legacy fund, right? This is a little complicated, so I'm going to spell it out for you. The legacy fund gets revenues from oil extraction and production taxes, right? So the oil industry produces oil and they pay taxes on that activity, and a portion of that goes into the legacy fund, which forms the principal. Now, the principal itself is invested in all sorts of different ways, and those investments produce revenues, and a portion of those revenues, half of the earnings from each 2-year budget cycle, would be then put into an income tax reduction fund, which would, do exactly what it says. It would reduce the income tax. The idea would be over time, as earnings in that fund built up, we would be able to replace the income tax altogether so that the state of North Dakota doesn't have an income tax. Now, the Grand Fork, this proposal was killed earlier this session, and Governor Burgum has called it bad policy, but I'm not so sure that it is. And it's been brought back again as the legislative session comes to an end, and I think it merits serious discussion. Now, the Grand Forks Herald editorial board, which is editorialized in favor of doing all sorts of things with our legacy fund earnings, including dumping more money into North Dakota's bloated university system. We have 11 public universities for a state that graduates around 7,000 high school seniors a year. Even if every single one of those students, by the way, went to a North Dakota, not only went to college, but went to a North Dakota college, we still wouldn't have enough students produced in the state of North Dakota to fill all those campuses up. So I don't know. Anyway, everybody's always moaning and groaning about how we need to do something visionary with the legacy fund. And certainly I've spent a lot of time talking about it on this show because, it's a big pot full of billions of our tax dollars that's just sitting there with no defined purpose at all. Now, if you want to talk about doing something visionary with all that money, if you want to talk about doing something that's long lasting, that's going to benefit all North Dakotans, could you do much better than reducing the income tax? I'm not sure that you could. Everybody who works in the state of North Dakota pays the income tax. If the income tax was zero, we would all have more money in our pockets. It's not a bad thing. Now, usually the rebuttal to this goes something along the lines of, nobody ever talks about reducing the income tax. North Dakota's income tax is already low. Why do we need to do anything about the income tax? The income tax doesn't matter. And my answer to that is, if the income tax doesn't matter, why not get rid of it? And by the way, not just get rid of it for individuals, but get rid of it for corporations too. I mean, you want to talk about wanting to attract more businesses to come to the state of North Dakota and diversify our economy. You want to talk about bringing more workers into our state. How about, hey, Businesses, hey, individuals, you don't have to pay an income tax on what you earn. I think that sounds like a pretty good pitch. Even if North Dakota's income tax is low, so what? If it doesn't exist, that means you don't have to comply with it. You don't have to do a state filing. You don't have to pay anything. And by the way, most of you probably are, in fact, paying some money into the state income tax. It is actually costing you money, and you are actually having to take the time to file that return. What if it just didn't exist? Wouldn't that be a nice thing? Now, the other argument is that, well, North Dakota has to have a three-legged stool, and if we're not paying the income tax, right, if corporations and individuals aren't paying an income tax, well, then that's just going to put upward pressure on other taxes. But that's the whole point of using the legacy fund. Now, I actually talked to Governor Burgum about this a while ago, and one thing that he said is that, you know, if we use legacy fund earnings for this, that we're just making ourselves more dependent on the oil and gas industry. And in fact, I've heard from people in the oil and gas industry who make the same argument, but it's worth remembering that we're not really making ourselves dependent on the oil and gas industry. I mean, yes, the legacy fund, that comes from oil and gas tax earnings, but once that money is deposited, it becomes the legacy fund principal, and that is a much different sort of asset. Again, as we accumulate billions and billions of dollars in the legacy fund, those billions are unless we spend it in some way, those billions are always going to be there, whatever happens to the oil industry. Right? I mean, if we stopped pumping oil in North Dakota tomorrow, the $6 or so billion that are in the legacy fund right now aren't going anywhere. That money's there, and it's invested, and it's still going to kick off earnings, and those earnings could still be used to replace the income tax. And here, by the way, if for some reason in the future we had to bring back the income tax, we could. This proposal that would use legacy fund earnings would leave the income tax code in place. It would just reduce the rates down to zero. If at some point in the future it turned out that we needed the income tax again, we could always raise those rates up again. But listen, other states get away without doing it. South Dakota, for instance, to our neighbors to the south, the lesser Dakota, as we here in North Dakota like to joke and poke a little fun at our southern neighbors, but they don't have an income tax. They seem to get along with it just fine. What's the big deal? I think the big deal is that people want to use the legacy fund to grow government, right? I think the real legacy of the legacy fund is going to be growing government, because here's what I'm afraid is going to happen. We're going to grow and grow the legacy fund, and eventually we're going to start finding ways to spend it, and we're going to spend it on universities, and we're going to spend it on some other stupid ideas, or maybe somebody's going to come along, maybe some billionaire, right? Like we've seen with some of these initiated measures, is going to come along with deep pockets, and they're going to spend $250,000 or $500,000 to collect a bunch of signatures, and they're going to put some issue on the ballot, and then they're going to spend that legacy fund. They're going to drink our milkshake before we ever get a chance to use it ourselves. That's what I'm afraid is going to happen to the legacy fund. We're going to use it in some way to grow government. It's not going to really benefit us. It's just going to be another revenue stream to pump money into government. You're still going to be paying the same amount of taxes, but on top of that, we're going to have the legacy fund pumping more money into government, and we're going to have more. All it's going to be is a fuel cell to grow government. Now, one way we could counterbalance that is maybe if we use the legacy fund to replace some of the taxes we're already paying. Like the income tax, right? Now, I understand that the desire. Let's not put all our eggs in one basket. In fact, I have argued against eliminating the income tax in the past on that very basis. If we just get rid of the income tax, then that just puts upward pressure on, the sales tax. That just puts upward pressure on property taxes, right? I mean, it's 6 of one or half dozen or another. It doesn't really matter which of my pockets they're taking the money out of. It's still my money, and they're still taking it from me. But if you have a revenue source like the legacy fund, right, it's taxes the oil industry is paying. It's going into a fund. That fund is invested. That fund kicks off revenues. If we use those revenues to reduce the amount of taxes that you and I pay, what's so bad about that? And talk about a legacy fund. If North Dakota suddenly becomes a state without a corporate or personal income tax, I think that's a pretty gosh darn good legacy. I think that's something that could be a real game changer for our state. Now, unfortunately, I think folks such as the Grand Forks Herald editorial board and others, and I don't want to say necessarily Governor Burgum, because I believe what he says when he says he's a fiscal conservative. I believe him, but I think he's a little misguided on this one. But generally, all of these people coming together and they're saying, we got to use the legacy fund for something, visionary, but all of their vision has to do with just growing more government. And that's not what I want the legacy fund to be. I didn't want to create the legacy fund in the first place. I don't like the idea of just stockpiling billions of tax dollars in a fund for no defined purpose at all. But hey, we did it. It's there. We got to do something with it now. So how about that something be reducing the tax burdens of every working North Dakotan and every business owner in the state? Sounds like a plan to me. My guest coming up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. My guest now is Jim Keller. He is a high school math teacher, a driver's education instructor. He's from Elgin, North Dakota. He's also a past president of the North Dakota Driver Traffic and Safety Education Association, which, Jim, I think is just a bunch of driver's ed instructors, right? I mean, that's basically what that organization is?
Yeah, most of the driver's ed teachers in the state of North Dakota are involved in it. And then there's a few private driving schools. There's a few instructors, college instructors that come over. And then there are just a few organizations that work with driver's ed, like dealing with the brakes and signage and things like that are also involved in the organization. And then safety people.
Now, I was actually surprised. Recently, you wrote a guest post for SayAnythingBlog.com about Senate Bill 2156, which in its original form requested a $1 fee per non-commercial driver's license in the state of North Dakota, which would have gone to a fund to support driver's education programs in public and private schools around the state. The bill was amended down to 25 cent per plate fee, and then the bill was ultimately killed. But first, let's start here, because I was actually surprised when that post went up. A lot of the reaction I got from readers were people who were surprised to learn that driver's education's not actually like a state requirement to graduate. I think a lot of people thought it was, and I guess it's not.
No. Now with driver's ed, they've taken it out of the school because, again, cost-cutting savings for a lot of them. They used to have it as a classroom, and now it's outside of the classroom, usually in summer. There's probably only about 5 to 8 programs that run full year, all year round, still left in the state. I know Minot is. Wahpeton has one. I'm not sure of all the ones that do, but there's like 5 to 8 that run them in school. Otherwise, it's during the summertime after school, and then it's 30 hours of classroom, 6 hours driving, and 6 hours observation time. And, so no longer required in school.
That's kind of amazing. I took it in school. I went to Minot High School, and I took it as part of it. Interestingly enough, I had already had my driver's license by the time I took it in school. I got my driver's license very early at 14 at the time. So, I had it by the time I had my license, by the time I was taking driver's ed, but it was required in the curriculum in Minot at the time. But I guess it's not anymore. Why was this funding so important? Tell us, what's the status quo with driver's education in the state of North Dakota?
Well, the problem is right now you're prorated during the summertime for each student that you have. And each student that you get in allows about $500, a little bit more than that per student. But if you charge a fee like most schools do, between $100 and $150, then that they take out that prorated fee that they give you. They take out of $100, they take out $75 out of that, and you'd lose that in funding because you charge a tuition. So not all the fees are getting covered in driver's ed because you have your instructors, you have your gas, you have your fuel. A lot of places lease the vehicle. There's a lot of expenses for driver's ed teachers going back to class to stay current, on the new information out there. And there's a lot of new things out there that can really be big liability issues. Like in-car cameras are great. They allow you to not only help the student visualize or see what they just did, but also records in and out of the car. So it takes away a lot of liability issues. The newer brakes that are out there now, they're less cumbersome. Dealerships love them because they don't do any damage to their vehicle. The vehicles, they lease you. It's one bolt hole, and it's great. I mean, they just love them. And now you're able to get cars rather than get the old beaters that they had in the back lot, you know, where they have to drill a couple holes through and stuff like that. So, yeah. And then the money we have, our teachers are having to pay for their own conferences to go back to get their credits. And in North Dakota, it's required for driver's ed teachers to get 2 credits every 5 years to renew their license. We are the only teaching organization that specifically has to go back for driver's education credits. You know?
Yeah, it's so essentially what you're saying is there's training expenses, there's new equipment, there's new technology, cameras, like you said, which, you know, maybe to protect, you know, as an insurance policy for both the student and the teacher to, you know, so there's a record of what's going on in the car. You know, the brakes. I mean, it's not free. You know, doing this sort of instruction costs money, and it seems that from what you're saying, these programs have been sacrificed to save money across the state, and so there's just fewer and fewer of these programs available for students.
Right, and we actually lost in the last couple of years. We've lost 6 programs that they no longer offer them in their district. And in fact, I called Grand Forks teachers, the guy in charge, and visited with him. They went from 20 teachers now; they're down to 14. And you know, it's getting to be a crisis. Now they can't service as many students. Other districts lost their driving programs. We had 3 come in requesting driving programs in the legislative sessions, which I sat in. There were 3 districts that came in and said, we don't have driver's ed because we can't get anybody for it. But it costs money to get those teachers trained, and, you know, and it's out of their pocket.
Yeah. And if it's, I mean, who's going to sign up to, I mean, let's face it. I mean, I think a lot of people who teach are passionate people, and they care about what they're teaching, and they care about making the world a better place. But there's also financial realities, and they're human beings, and they got to go home and pay bills and, you know, justify how they spend their time away from their families. And it's tough if you're going out of pocket to do it. That's a tough decision to make. Tell me, as this has declined, do you feel there's been an impact on road safety in North Dakota?
Oh, yeah. You know, you see driving schools are popping up, and they're trying to fill in some gaps there because they'll take the kids out for 6 hours driving time. And, you know, where driver's ed teachers do the same thing, but we also give them observation time, and we also give them the classroom time, and we're also trying to make them defensive drivers. And so you see a lot of that, you know, driving schools popping up, and a lot more in the recent years, you know, to fill a gap in there because we don't have it. But they're not teaching that classroom time. Most are not, anyway. I'd venture to guess 3 to 4 in our state are actually teaching it in the driver's schools. So you're losing that teaching time for those kids to learn how to be a defensive driver. And yeah, and it has to translate into more accidents on the road. It has to. The less you know, as you know yourself, the more experience you get, the better usually you become at it. The more you can react to whatever situation you're given. And that's very true in a car, you know, and that's why statistics show that the younger driver is more unsafe than the older driver. They get more accidents, more crashes. The evidence supports it. You know,
I will say, just for personal experience, the first motor vehicle license that I got was actually my motorcycle license. I had a Class M license before I had my Class D. As it worked out, I was just kind of a nut for motorcycles at the time. But before I could get that license, I had to go to a multi-week motorcycle safety course, and we did everything. I mean, there was a lot. There were hours and hours of classroom time. just on the different controls and all of that stuff before they even let us get on a motorcycle. And then once I was on the motorcycle, I learned I had ridden motorcycles before. I had just little mini bikes and things like that. I learned so much from that program and became such a better driver. It made a big difference. So I do not doubt you for a minute. And even though I had my driver's license before I took driver's ed in school, I didn't feel like I learned a lot. I learned things that I continue to use to this day. And I've never had a traffic accident. I've had a few speeding tickets, unfortunately, but I've never had a traffic accident. And I credit that to the time, in the instruction that I got in the classroom. Now, tell me a little bit about this bill, Senate Bill 2156. It's failed now. It was amended in the Senate from $1 per plate down to 25 cents per plate. But when it got to the House, the Education Committee gave it a do not pass, and it failed by a pretty wide margin on the floor. Where did this bill come from? What would it have done, and why did we need it?
Okay, well, originally when I was president at the time, and we found out that we're losing more and more driver's ed instructors than we're gaining, and it's because of funding. It's just not there. And so then I thought, why not $1 a plate? I know you just talked about your motorcycle abate in North Dakota. They actually put on the program, and they have a funding in the state right now. It's been there for quite a while. Every motorcycle license gets $10 a plate, and it goes back to teaching, like you just learned, that class that you took. They do such a great job with it. They're wonderful instructors, but they take the time, and they have the funding for it, and they get reimbursed for it through the state of North Dakota.
Yeah.
You can look that up. And that's where it came from. And I thought, well, why not $1 plate, non-commercial? That would be enough money. That driver's license, I didn't want to go that way. So I went with a license plate, and I figured $1, that would fund driver's education, and it would keep it a viable and stable program where you're not losing driver's ed instructors throughout the state. Because we are a gray-haired society. If you look at the majority of the driver's ed instructors, most of them in the next 10 years will probably retire. And there's not enough people coming up in the ranks because they don't want to necessarily lose their summer. That's part of it. The second is a lot of the kids nowadays have never drove. Fortunately, when we were kids, we were always driving. We were always out in the pickups. We were always out in the fields. We were always out, on the back roads with our parents. They were letting us drive and practice. We actually drove, like you said, motorcycles. We were on our motorcycles when I was a little kid. And we had that experience where I'm having more and more kids come into the classroom, never been behind the wheel of even a lawn tractor.
Yeah.
And so we have these teachers that don't want to get involved because, you're putting your hands, the wheels that are on the hands that are on the wheel are a 14-year-old kid. And you have to, give them the confidence to drive. And then when they go out of their comfort zone, you have to be there to support them as the vehicle's moving. And people don't realize, a lot of teachers are like, I don't need the risk. And that's where we're losing them. And also, they don't want to do that extra time and put out their own money to get that. And so I was looking for a way to just fund the things that aren't funded, that aren't provided in driver's education.
So this would have been $1 a plate, and that plate goes into a fund, and then that fund in turn would make grants to programs. How would that have worked?
Right. Yeah, it would have been DPI would have ran it. First of all, I wanted DMV or the North Dakota DOT to run it. They said no, they would rather not, and DPI said we would run it for you, and it would be because all the dollars coming in is public and non, and private, because everybody's paying into the fund. I said every driver's ed program in North Dakota for public schools or private schools, like high schools, that is, not private driving schools, but public schools and private schools, they would get funding. They would put, okay, we need a brake this year. The brake costs $400. They would put their request in. DPI would say, okay, they haven't had a brake. This is the brake. Because once you get a brake, it lasts you 10 years usually, until you get the new update. And the brakes are really great nowadays. And so that's what they would have ran and they said they would have worked it all out. and they would have had input from our organization. They would have had input from all the driver's ed teachers to try to, and they had a good understanding of what was going on. So that's how the money would have been dispersed. And I thought it was good. And then it would have been dispersed to recruit new teachers. It costs about $3,500 just for their credits. That's not the university fees. That's not the cost for them going to the classes. That's how much it costs per teacher. And that's not their time involved, and so that's all out of pocket for most of them because schools don't have that in their budget,
Your post got some reactions to me from lawmakers. I don't know what your conversations have been like, but a few of the lawmakers told me that raising fees on the registration and the driver. I mean, look at the driver's license fee issue right now. I mean, the legislature passed an increase in the driver's license fee. Governor Burgum vetoed it. The legislature has been trying to overturn. In fact, I think the House failed to overturn it last week by the time this podcast airs. So, there's not a lot of appetite in the public for raising these fees, which I think is unfortunate. I think the driver's license fee should have gone up. We haven't raised it since 1987, for crying out loud. It's just by inflation. I mean, even if we doubled it, just by dint of inflation, we'd still be paying less than what we were paying in 1987. Anyway, that's a different issue. But there's not a lot of appetite out there. One thing that somebody brought up is, why are we not using the Common Schools Trust Fund for this? I mean, it's a trust fund that's intended for education. That's what this is. I mean, this is literally programs in our schools and even our private schools. And also, the Common Schools Trust Fund, a lot of people don't know this, gets revenue from traffic fines. In fact, if the North Dakota Highway Patrol, not necessarily municipal, like if the city police gives you a speeding ticket, that's different. But the Highway Patrol, if they write you a ticket and you pay your fine, that goes into the Common Schools Trust Fund. I can't think of a better way to use some of that money than to turn around and give it to driver education programs. That seems logical. I realize that this bill has failed this legislative session. Do you think that's something that could work going forward?
Oh, yes. And here's the other side of the coin. I'm not done with this because I think that you'd be surprised there's a lot more support for it in North Dakota than you would imagine, because I think a lot of people realize that to get the younger people educated, where they receive that same education in school like you did and I did, it's not available now. They want it back in their communities.
Yeah.
It was number one on North Dakota DOT when they did their Vision Zero, and when they went out and they wanted to find out what was there. Number one, let's put driver's education back into school.
Yeah.
That was one of their number one things on their list that every community that they went to responded with, to have driver's ed in school. So I think it really is out there in the public eye. I think what happened here was the representatives from the House didn't really understand it.
Sure.
Or didn't understand the principle of it as well, where the Senate had a better understanding of it at the time.
Well, I honestly, I don't know how many in the public. I know you're saying it's really popular. Just judging by my readership's reaction, a lot of people didn't know that this was happening. A lot of people aren't aware of the decline in these programs, and particularly if it's people whose kids maybe graduated a long time ago or they don't have kids. I don't think they necessarily know that this isn't really available anymore, that these programs have declined. And I wasn't aware statewide. Minot still got a program. That's where my kids went to school, and that was what it was, and I just assumed that was still going on all over the state, and it wasn't. And so this has all been news to me. And again, just to close this out, I think this is important for a state like North Dakota. Driving here is tricky. We consistently rank near the top in the country among states with accidents and collisions and injuries and unfortunately fatalities. And some of that is our drinking and driving problem, which is a topic probably for another show. But some of it too is we got a lot of long roads home, and we got a lot of dirt roads, and we have a lot of extreme weather. And so driving here, and we drive a lot in North Dakota because it's a big spread out place, and everybody who lives here has got to have a driver's license. It's not like New York where maybe you can get by just riding the subway every day. If you want to live and work in North Dakota, you got to drive. So this seems pretty central to our way of life here in North Dakota. If we want safer roads, hey, how about we invest in driver safety, driver instruction? That just makes sense to me.
Yeah, and that's where I was coming from. I really think it's important in North Dakota because, like you said, everyone drives. we probably drove to work today. We don't get an opportunity just to take a tram or something like that. We think nothing of driving, a couple hours away. We think that's just cakewalk.
Normal.
And people are like, you drove 60 miles? How long did that take you? About 60 minutes.
Yeah.
And they're like, what? It took us 4 hours to do something like that,
Well, it's wide open spaces. You get on the highway, you drive at 60, 65 miles an hour. It's not hard to eat up that time. So, Jim, speaking of time, I appreciate yours. Thank you for coming on talking about this.
All right. Well, thank you also.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Before we go, a favor, and I know I ask this a lot, but if you haven't done it yet, it really helps. If you're listening to this podcast on a platform that allows you to rate or review, this is something like Apple Podcasts or iTunes or Stitcher, if you would leave an honest rating and review, it really helps get this show out. It tells all the algorithms in these services that this is a show that people are listening to and care about, and then it makes it more likely that they're going to recommend us to other listeners. So that really helps out. If you could do that, I would appreciate it. If you ever have any feedback on the show, if you have questions for our weekly guest, Senator Kevin Cramer, Congressman Kelly Armstrong. By the way, I usually interview Senator Cramer on Wednesdays. His answers come up on Thursdays. And then on Thursdays, I interview Congressman Armstrong. That interview actually airs on Fridays. So that's sort of the timeline. You can email questions in for them at any time. We've been getting quite a few every week now. I've been very pleased with the response on that. But remember, you can do that at any time. Rob at sayanythingblog.com. Follow me on social media. I'm at Rob Port on Twitter. Just search for me on Facebook, Rob Port. Say Anything Blog has a Facebook page and a Twitter feed as well. Follow those. And if you do follow me, say hi, because I like it when people say hi. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again.